welcome to the security seminar from Purdue University. Today's speaker is Jerry Solomon, and he will speak on Tivoli Integrated Service Management security designs and considerations. Jerry.
Thank you. Today I'm going to kind of run you through from soup to nuts, everything from concepts at the beginning all the way to perhaps touching on some technical details of doing an ISM project, is what we call it, Integrated Service Management at IBM, which is a suite of products based on the J2EE technologies with WebSphere. So first we'll talk about kind of the challenge that IT companies are facing and how does that relate to the project that we're going to try to discuss. A little bit of an overview of the IBM product set, and then we'll delve right into the product set. And I say Maximo. MRO was a company that was acquired by IBM a few years ago, and all of their products were Maximo, and so we affectionately refer to everything new as still as Maximo. We'll talk some about security considerations for the application itself, both at the base level, what comes in the product, as well as extensions that people do to it. We'll also talk about WebSphere security, which is kind of the behind-the-scenes controls that holds everything together, from authorization, authentication, WebSphere VMM, which is the virtual member manager, and a little bit about Tivoli Directory Integrator and custom solutions that people have to come up with when they go too far off the map from what the product has been designed to do. So first of all, this is the kind of landscape that companies find themselves in. There is a lot of change out there, market demands, workloads, service levels, compliance, issues, things like HIPAA, privacy regulations for medical data, Sarbanes-Oxley, everything else that's out there as far as regulations can impact technical solutions as well, because companies have requirements about what people can see, who can see it, under what circumstances, being able to assign something and say that this person is eligible to see my medical records, things like that. As well as all of these other things that really play into the projects. But you can see that it's a very complicated world that all of these projects get plopped down into the middle of. And a lot of times when our consultants are looking at it and the customers, people who are in charge of the project start thinking about it, they think of it purely in terms of it's a product feature, right? Security is just something I turn on and off. And they don't understand that it's until you sit down and start explaining to them that it's a much bigger world than that. And when an implementation specialist comes on site to do the implementation of the product, sure, they have to throw a few switches and link things together, but it's a much bigger picture than just that. This shows the IBM IT Service Management portfolio, and you can kind of see in the security management, we also have some additional products that we integrate into these solutions, things like Tivoli Access Manager. Access Manager is a product set that enables us to say, for say a big hotel chain, you're a hotel chain valued customer and you log onto the website and you are a double diamond member of the hotel chain. The things that you see on the screen can be customized and revealed according to your level of membership or your access that they give you into the applications. And that also has similar use within our ISM products. There's also another one that plays in really directly, Tivoli Directory Server, which is IBM's LDAP server, and Tivoli Directory Integrator, which is a Swiss Army knife, very useful, can be scripted and create things called assembly lines, and we'll talk more about that later, to enable you to do things that you might not be able to do with the straight up products that you're dealing with. There's also a Security Compliance Manager, which is an interesting product set. It involves things like being able to do intelligence and say, notice patterns to say, so-and-so logged in at 5 o'clock in the morning they never log in at 5 o'clock in the morning. Someone needs to look at their access records. What did they access in this session at 5 o'clock in the morning? Or notice patterns. So-and-so tried to log in, they weren't successful. Then 5 minutes later, so-and-so tried to log in, it wasn't successful. Then so-and-so tried to log in 5 minutes later to maybe detect hacking into your network. The Maximo-based product has been built so that we can control security for the application itself using a model that involves security groups. So we create groups that equate to security for the application, things like change managers. For those of you that are familiar with IBM uses this model. It's called ITIL, the Infrastructure Technology or Information Technology Infrastructure Library, which is a set of standards developed by the UK. They actually have a set of standards for security now, but we follow them as much as we can. But we created these security groups. Change manager is an example of a group of people who would be responsible for things. We also have what's called a role within the product. So a person can be assigned to a role, and a role can be put into a workflow, which is a construct to cause work to happen. And when you put the role in the workflows and you build 12 workflows and they all have that role in there, and then Dan quits, and now John works here, and Dan has left and John has his role, then you just move him into the role and you don't have to go back and change any of your workflows. So that's what that's for. Also, there are some initially configured person groups that the product managers created to describe how they think that the product should work in an ITIL-like world. We also have this concept of a master user, the max admin, and I would say 99 out of 100 customers have security standards that say, of course, you can't have a max admin user because everyone in the world knows that if you have Maximo, you have a max admin user, so that's not going to work for us, so they need to rename it. But we'll work with the max admin user to get the install going and then change it over to be whatever their user is that they want to use in that place. All the rest of this kind of talks about some of the basic functions, which not extremely important, but just wanted to kind of give you a flavor for the product itself and what it has in there. This shows you some examples of the mapping. You can see how we have roles and people and persons. It's interesting, when we look at the product, we have defined these two different things to be user and person. And a user is someone who can log into the system, but a person is an entity that we care to have information about. So for instance, where you have our product, Service Request Manager, is a help desk product, you may have all kinds of people who can call into your help desk, but you don't want them to be able to log into the help desk product. So they're not users, but they're persons. So your help desk operator has a user record, and they log in, and they can record information when that person calls to open a help desk ticket. And those person records may extend outside your company even. It could be vendors. It could be your customers. If you're, let's say, a utility company, and you want all of your utility customers to be able to go to the web and open a ticket and say, my outlet has blown, or whatever it is that you want them to open a ticket about, then they need to be able to go to a user interface and do that. And so then you're deciding, do these people need to be users, or am I okay with them just being persons? And the person record, when you look inside the database at a technical level, contains all the real details, and it's associated with the user. So wherever there's a user, there's always a person, but wherever there's a person, there's not necessarily a user. We also have things in the product that account for those people in different ways, like labor. So for instance, the MRO product Maximo was built on the Enterprise Asset Management, and Purdue's facilities department actually uses the Maximo product for facilities. So whenever someone at Purdue opens a ticket to request for someone to come move tables into a room or to take tables out of a room or whatever else, they're opening a ticket in Maximo. And there can be labor records that are associated with that, so that John Smith, who works in the facilities department, can be assigned to go and move those tables. And as well, it expands out from there into all different directions, including things like finance. And what you see there, the GL account site and location information, that relates it back to cost centers. So that whenever one person opens a ticket, you can say their cost center is this, which means you're going to charge their department for that. So when it costs $100 to move the table and chairs out of the room, then that equates back to their cost center and they get charged for that. This shows you kind of at the level of data. You can see what we have here, the user and security groups, security profiles that are built for users to say, in this application, this user can do this. You can be very granular and say, in one application, this user can do these kinds of things, and in another application, they can't. And you can also take that across some of the other things that you see there. So on this site, this user can do this, but on this site, the user can't. And a site would be things like the Purdue West Lafayette campus versus the Calumet campus versus IUPUI or whatever, so that a user can look at data that relates to sites that they've been authorized to see. And you can see the data restrictions, object attributes, collections, all those things. The product used to be designed so that customers had to create custom copies of an application. So the change application, for instance, would have to be rebuilt, and you would remove fields from the screen so they couldn't see them. But now what the product does with IBM is have these concepts of data restriction, so that all you have to do is toggle the groups, memberships that are responsible for those fields so that people can or can't see them. And this kind of gives you an example of one product. This is the Tivoli Service Automation Manager tool. And you can see out of the box they've created a bunch of different roles, and associated with those roles can be person groups and individual roles, and then security groups. And what you'll notice here in this green column is that security groups equate to your security source, which in our case is usually an LDAP of some sort. And so you'll create those security groups in LDAP, and the product equates those security groups back to the roles and person groups within the product. What kinds of things do you think people might be interested in doing? Well, one of the things that we have is this product set add-on that creates a service provider model, so that you can set up your company and say that you're really good at doing max mode, the asset management, and you want to sell that out to other people. So we've created functionality within the product to restrict it so that you can be a service provider, and you can subcontract out for company A, company B, company C, company D, and when someone goes and logs in, they're restricted to their company's data. And when you run reports based on their company's data. It can be a little bit of a nightmare if you started to think you were relying on people to write queries that somehow were built properly to restrict the data so they wouldn't be pulling data from another customer. So it's most of the time no one is going to try to take that on their own. They're going to do that within the product. Another idea might be, I recently dealt with a government agency, the concept of classified. And so there's an application, the ability within the application for you to bootstrap on other applications. And in this case, they have a wizard, and the wizard says, push the button, the wizard pops up and says, does this data need to be restricted to top secret only? And they would answer that, and suddenly records would get populated within the data to say it's top secret. And then you would be restricting data within the product in a customized fashion then, so that people who have top security clearance or above can see the top secret data, but other people can't. It has some kind of interesting implications when you start thinking about it, because if you're a just government employee working at the post office and you call and open a ticket against whatever government installation that it is, and you have some kind of clearance, and the person that opens your ticket for you types that in there, and they make a mistake and put top secret in, and suddenly you can't see it anymore. And then when you try to call back, of course, then the armed guards rush in and grab you and pull you out for trying to access top secret information. Customer and vendor models as well. When you're looking at dealing with, for instance, maybe a large manufacturing company who has dealers out in the field, and the dealers sell their products, and they want the dealers to be able to log into their help desk and say, this tractor has a broken whatever axle, and so I need to open a help desk ticket to get a replacement part for that tractor. And the tractor is really owned by the company that bought it, the dealer perhaps, or maybe it's not owned by the dealer. Maybe it's owned by the original manufacturer. And so you need to be able to track that kind of information. And so they put in capability within the product for people to customize and deal with situations like that. Financial institutions also have security implications. Things like, let's say it's a credit card company, is one everybody can identify with pretty easily. You call in and you say, I'm having trouble with my Visa card and my number is 999-99-99999. And they type that into your help desk ticket. Now, any analyst at that company who has access to the tickets could pull it up and see that your card number was 999-99999. But in most of these cases, what I've seen is that people will write customizations to the Java object so that it will go through and recognize patterns and say, if it looks like a credit card number, it probably is a credit card number, and we change it to XXXXX so that that data is not there. And maybe, perhaps, even create a secondary record that could be linked to with authentication to actually pull back the record that has the actual number in it. This kind of shows about WebSphere security, and this is what most of the time that people are dealing with when they conceptually think of the security within the product. But everything else that we've talked about kind of lets you know that it's a lot bigger picture than just what's in WebSphere. And very seldom is it as straightforward, even as what you see on the screen. But I'll kind of point out the components that I deal with a lot. First, you can see over here there's a user who is making an authentication request, and it's coming in with HTTP request. It's possible that this customer may also have a single sign-on solution. For instance, perhaps Kerberos. And this authentication request is going to be intercepted. And the interceptor is going to be responsible for doing the authentication of that Kerberos request, and then it will be handed back off to WebSphere, in which case suddenly this picture doesn't look hardly anything like what it does now. But in this case, the straightforward version, WebSphere is going to get that authenticated through what's called the Virtual Member Manager, which is VMM. And VMM is capable of federating multiple information sources. So you can have multiple LDAPs associated with VMM. Of course, WebSphere has a very specific list of we support this, we support this, we support this, and we support this. And if you stray away from that list, then suddenly you have other problems, which I'll mention in just a second. But in this case, assuming that it's just a straight up LDAP that we're used to, Virtual Member Manager will pull those entries in, and it has a remote interface so that suddenly in WebSphere you will see all those users that come from your LDAP source. So if it's Active Directory, for instance, that you synchronize with, or IBM Directory Server, all those entries that were in that definition that you've specified for the string, it's going to pull back those users that match that and pull them into VMM and then be able to use those within the product. One of the things that you'll recognize also in this drawing is that there is a CCMDB process runtime database. In this particular product slide, it happens to be from one of the products called CCMDB, but the product itself has a database of those users. And so those users need to come for authentication into WebSphere for VMM and then get handed off for authorization within the product. Those security roles and person groups and security groups that we saw, membership in those gets associated into the product through the LDAP interface. And so what we do to bring those in is we have what we call VMM cron task, so Virtual Member Manager cron task. And that cron task, periodically, however often you have it set to run, typically like every 15 minutes, would go out to the LDAP and say, who's new? Or what was the last LDAP record that I read? And it will see if there are new ones that are beyond that, and then pull all of those records in and process them through this cron task, which has a mapping to say, from Active Directory, these are the fields that I know how to pull in. Things like the address and the phone number, and perhaps city, state, zip, all of those kinds of things. And hopefully that will be populated in their Active Directory source. But sometimes we're not that lucky. In which case we have to create integrations with other products. And this MIA component that's listed on here, the Maximal Enterprise Adapter, is often used for that, to interface with like an HR system. Because a lot of times companies will say, well, my HR records are the authoritative record for all employees. And so the user ID that's created for the HR record is the one that should exist in Active Directory. And maybe not all of the information from HR has been populated into Active Directory, but we need it for Maximo, because how are we going to bill and how are we going to know that this person's manager is so-and-so unless we have a source of information for that? And so a lot of times we go back to their HR system to pull that data in. So suddenly it's become a lot more complicated than just Active Directory. Now we're interfacing with an HR system. Well, then add on to that the complexity of, let's say that your company tomorrow decides we want to buy this company. And now we need to bring all those people in and make them help desk users too. So now we've got to deal with, gee, what kind of an LDAP system do they have? And what's in there? And how do we integrate that in? And then what happens when their LDAP system doesn't have that data and we need to interface with a second HR system and start pulling records in? And then you start looking at, well, now I've got the additional problem that they have a John Smith working for them and I have a John Smith working for me. And their user IDs are both J. Smith. So then what happens? And it becomes very complicated, and it's not even usually the case where that's going to happen in the future. A lot of times when I'm walking into a project, that's what's already there. And in fact, in some cases, previous implementations of different products, they have strategies for dealing with this. Like at one customer, they had so many integrations from companies that they bought that they ended up creating custom users based on the email address of the user. They couldn't even go back and change and say, you know, John Smith at XCO and John Smith at YCO. They just created a user ID, John Smith XCO and John Smith YCO. And so suddenly you've got their Active Directory, which has one user ID that you're dealing with, and then you have a user ID within the product, which is completely different than that. And how do you create mappings between that? And that's where you start looking at things like the Tivoli Directory Integrator with an assembly line. I'm pulling out and writing code to deal with something like that. So, and then a lot of people ask me, so, you know, how many hours does it take to do a security setup of the implementation? And it's just not a simple question. You can see that there are a lot of things that go into it and a lot of pieces. Very rarely, when I've showed up on site, have they already even decided things like, for your LDAP integration, because we have all these security groups, what are the security groups going to be named? So we have out of the box, we say one is called Change Manager. And so there's a security group called Change Manager. Well, you have a standard that says all security groups within this company will be named GL underscore, you know, a name. So it's going to be GL Change Manager. And so then you say, okay, well, that's fine and everything, but you're going to have 4 environments because you're going to have a development environment and a test environment and a staging environment and a production environment. So are you going to use the same security group for all 4 of those environments? Do you really want that? So that a person could log into your test environment and have some kind of access and then have the same access in production? Most of the time the answer is no. So suddenly then you're looking at either 4 different LDAPs or 4 different strings to control the OUs for where those groups are located within their LDAP. And then we're populating 4 different paths to bring things in. Or it could be other things like multiple domains and multiple forests in Active Directory. So then you're creating multiple VMMs to deal with different forests, some of which may trust others, some of which may not. It can be very complicated just sitting down and trying to think everything through and decide what group is responsible for what and who do you have to interface with. In corporations, most of the time what I see is security people are kind of off all to themselves. They have like their own little world and don't bother me except by sending me a ticket to request something. And then hopefully I'll get back to you within my agreed upon period of time that I have to respond to you. And then hopefully the people at the customer have thought about this before I'm coming so that I'm not sitting there waiting for them to get a response back from the security group. But I always end up having a couple of hours discussion with security teams about all the different implications for things that we're going to see as we go through the implementation, and what kinds of considerations do they have for all of these things. It can impact the project a whole lot. If, for instance, they decide that they need to have, say, a SOX requirement to say that all of this data can only be seen by these 3 people in the company. Suddenly you're having to add functionality into what you're doing and test it to make sure that you've got it all right and that indeed those 3 people are the only ones who can see that data. What kinds of questions do you guys have?
Jerry, on the projects that you've worked on or have had the opportunity to see both the internal IBM or at the client spot, what are some of the common failings of security that you type of see? I mean, any horror stories or war stories are always fun to hear.
I've seen a lot of things that would just scare you half to death from a security standpoint. Like one customer environment where I went to that was open on the internet, and the max admin, out of the box, max admin user has the max admin password, the same thing. And that's on the internet. And you could log in as max admin, and have complete authority within their implementation. And that's the kind of thing that, none of you would probably make the mistake of doing, but there are people that did that. And also things with like wireless security, where they have wireless guest as their login to their production network with the password of wireless password. And then you start looking at things like people who want to cut costs can sometimes compromise on security as a good place to cut costs. Because doing all of this development and testing to make sure that data is restricted to one group or another is functionality, and functionality takes hours, and hours cost money. And money increases the cost of the project. And suddenly people who thought that they were going to shoestring this project into existence are suddenly faced with the fact that it's going to cost me a little bit of money to have somebody who actually knows what they're doing go through this and figure it all out. I've seen customers who have just given up and said, we can't make this work, we'll just go with it kind of like it is. And out of the box, you don't really have to have any of the security stuff turned on. You don't have to have LDAP integration. You can just use application security. So there's a flat file on the WebSphere server, and the flat file contains your users and groups, and that's all there is. When you hit it, it's logging into that WebSphere box and authenticating you against that flat file and deciding, okay, you can log in. But in general, there are a lot of really complicated environments out there, and the security people that have to deal with it have to be very top-notch and know what they're doing. So when I start having some of these discussions with some of the security people, I've been really impressed with what I've seen out there at some places. And other places, it's been a lot of challenge out there. Government places especially, it seems like state employees, for instance. I was at one state agency where they were promoted from road crews into IT. And literally no one could type. The Tivoli person had to take off every afternoon at 3 o'clock from doing Tivoli work to type emails for people because everybody else in IT couldn't type. And so what do you think their security was like? It was pretty non-existent. But it kind of shows through. I have this theory about when I walk into a customer environment that by looking at their furniture and their walls, you can tell a whole lot about what you should expect from what's going on there. If they have fairly decent furniture and, some paintings on the wall and it's not all gray, carpet, ceiling and walls, then you can kind of think they might have hired some people that can do something. But when you walk into one of those places where it's gray all around, you just kind of think, gee, they didn't spend a whole lot of money here. I shouldn't expect a whole lot. And so when you have some of these discussions with people, it really depends on what that environment is as to what you're going to recommend in the solution for them for security. Certainly something where, I'm working with a government agency that deals with classified information has a whole different level of approach to security than the ones who have wireless guest, wireless password.
Why is it that security groups are decoupled from the roles? Why aren't the permissions assigned directly to the roles?
One of the things that I've seen is that there is a great concern for separation of duties at a lot of customers, where the security team kind of operates off to themselves and they kind of stand away from the rest of the employees. So there's not even, any kind of suggestion that they're going to help someone to get access to information that they shouldn't have access to. And they usually follow regulations very closely, all their processes that are defined, and say, we have to go through this. I know that you need this today, but the regulations or the process says that you have to fill out this request. It has to go to your manager. Your manager has to approve it, and then their manager has to approve it, and then it comes back to me, and then I give you the access to the system. So I think that there's also the concern that I think security is one of those things, a necessary evil sometimes, but it's also the kind of thing where if the company doesn't understand the value of security, security kind of creates a mythos around itself so that people are afraid of security, and they know that there's value in security because the security people say that there's value in security, even when they themselves don't understand it. And so for a lot of different reasons, the security people create these auras around themselves to keep things going and do the right things, which we all know that they should be doing. But sometimes, companies will say, do I really need to have this person who deals with checking all of my security access records and looks for patterns and manages that software that does that? Do I really need that? And we all know that they do in today's day and age. But a lot of times it's not completely evident to people, especially some executives who came from another part of the company, not IT, who have to deal with that and are being charged for it. We're moving into kind of the maturity level in a lot of corporate customers that I'm seeing of doing chargebacks for everything. And so there is a cost associated with each person and all of their user IDs that have to be created and account maintenance, things like that. A lot of places have annual validation of accounts. Do you still require access to this resource? All of those kinds of things. And so there's a cost associated with that, and they are starting to recharge people for that. And so we're starting to see people questioning, what is this really worth? And the challenge will be to see if the security people step up to it and have all the right answers and can validate with information that shows what their value to in the corporate equation is.
Any other questions?
New hires that you get, where are areas that you think that students, not necessarily those from Purdue, but from wherever, are well prepared for a career with an IBM, and where they're probably lacking in their education?
I think for the most part, when IBM looks at a school, like we look at Purdue, and Purdue is actually a top tier school for IBM. We think very highly of Purdue. It's what we call a blue school, and because IBM's big blue. So we have the blue schools, and we have our non-blue schools. And Purdue is definitely a blue school. But we look at it, and we know the curriculum and what the integrity of the university is, and we make investments in things like donating computer labs to Purdue and things like that. So we recognize that there's a partnership between IBM and a university, that we try to create these relationships and get something both ways from this. But what we look at when we look at Purdue is, okay, now we know it's a blue school, but what do I care about from the students? And I think a lot of the challenges, things we look at, are for people who understand that they're not always going to be told what they need to do. I think Purdue does a pretty good job of that. I've talked to a lot of students who told me about how they were given an assignment. It was kind of vague, and they kind of knew what they were supposed to come up with, but not a whole lot of information in the middle. And it's like that in life and in the work field in IBM. They tell you that they need to have their LDAP integrated. Well, they don't tell you all the other things that go along with that. And you have to have the knowledge or to get that from other people and be motivated so that when you deliver what it is that you're supposed to be delivering, it is a complete solution. And 3 weeks later, somebody's going to come back to you and say, why didn't you do this? And why didn't you do that? And we also look for students who are thinkers and troubleshooters that can find their way out of a problem using resources that we have. Number one resource that I use probably 100 times a day is Google, just to find information about what's going on. And I look for problems that other people have had, where other people have this situation. I'm dealing with kind of one-off situations all the time, where customer has even AIX, which is an IBM operating system, and they have used there's a security package from Sweden, and I don't remember exactly the name of it, but it goes on top of AIX, and I knew almost nothing about it, never even had heard of it when I went there, and I couldn't install the product because of the security package. So I had to go out and Google it and find out what was going on. First, I wasn't convinced it existed because I couldn't find it in Google, because if it doesn't exist in Google, it doesn't exist. But people who can do that and can be very self-reliant and form networks. When you're working with people, this experience that you have at school where you have people in your classes and you get to know them, you eventually learn to cultivate that into professional relationships. And the social networking tools that are out there, the Facebook and the LinkedIn and all of those things, become ways that you are productive at doing things without consuming company resources necessarily. We rely on each other. We have our colleagues from other companies, we have them from around the world, from academia, wherever that we work with, to find the answers to these solutions and provide things without necessarily consuming all of IBM's resources on one little tiny problem. And so when we find students that are like that, it becomes something that really stands out. In fact, we found, I'm kind of like one of the poster children for this kind of employee myself, and I recruited someone else from Purdue who was a lot like me. And everybody has said every time I go, have you found another you yet? My manager has asked me many times to clone myself because they desperately need more of me. And so every time I come to campus, I'm constantly looking for people with all those kinds of skills to be able to jump into this situation. For instance, one of the things they have, whenever you're associated with a new technology, they always say there's a learning curve. And that learning curve can be very steep. And with the Maximo product, they say it's about 18 months. So before IBM really expects that you're going to be very productive with the product, it's about 18 months of you doing training classes, shadowing people, maybe doing simple implementations and things. And I did it in like 6 months. And so that's the kind of thing that we want to see, is people who will dig in and have the tenacity to learn what they don't know and to go forward. It's kind of one thing when I see employees and candidates that we're looking at where there are people that I just don't think have any other gumption to do anything other than, okay, I'm going to work till 5 o'clock and then I'm going home and I'm not going to think about this anymore until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. All the time I'm thinking about what's going on, the problems that I'm facing every day. And so, like, I don't know, I can't tell you how many times, like in the shower in the morning after I've had a good night's sleep, suddenly I come to that aha moment and I'm like, I know exactly how to fix the problem that we're facing. And that's the kind of students that IBM would really like to have a lot more of. If you're one of those students, please jump out and go to the website and apply for the jobs, because I desperately need at least 2 more of me. So if you think you might be one of those people, my manager's actively looking for you. But some of the other interesting things you may be interested in as far as security itself, careers at IBM, there is a whole group completely dedicated to doing security audits of customers. And that's their whole job. They go from customer to customer on a project to go in and examine every aspect of security, from physical all the way through information security. And they will make all the recommendations and write a report as to what's going on. In fact, the team is out of Austin, where I am, in Austin, Texas. And I don't specifically know if they're looking for people in that group right now, but I can guarantee you another thing is, if you really want something bad enough, you can usually find a way to make it happen. And if that's what you really want to do, there is a group out there that does it, and you just need to be the squeaky wheel to get in there.